Have you ever walked into a room and felt the silence press down on you? Not just quiet, but a hollow kind of silence, the kind that echoes with everything that's missing? That was Sarah's house every single day since the ambulance took her mother away 6 months ago. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of day that clung to the windows, gray and damp, a persistent drizzle turning the fallen leaves into a slick, brown carpet on the sidewalk. The air inside the old Victorian felt thick, heavy with dust motes dancing in the weak light, and the lingering scent of lavender polish, her mother's favorite. Sarah stood in the doorway of the living room, the room her mother had loved, now frozen in time. The Afghan was still folded neatly over the arm of the wingback chair. The book, a well-thumbed mystery novel, still lay open, face down, on the side table, bookmark forgotten. It was too much, and yet, not enough. The emptiness was a physical ache, a constant companion she couldn't shake. She tried everything, throwing herself into work, long walks that left her feet sore but her heart untouched, even redecorating the guest room, a frantic burst of activity that ended with her sitting on the floor, surrounded by paint swatches, sobbing into her knees. The grief was a stubborn fog, clinging, refusing to lift. Friends offered gentle suggestions. Get out more, Sarah? Maybe adopt a pet? Something to care for. The words were well-meaning, but they felt like pebbles dropped into a vast, dark well, vanishing without a ripple. Until this particular rain-slicked Tuesday. The quiet, the hollowness, it finally pushed her out the door. Not with hope, but with a desperate, almost angry need to do something, anything, to puncture the suffocating stillness. She drove without thinking, the wipers swishing a monotonous rhythm, until she found herself pulling into the gravel parking lot of the Haven County Animal Shelter. The sign was faded. The building, a converted ranch house, looked weary under the gray sky. The air inside hit her first, a complex, slightly overwhelming blend of antiseptic cleaner, damp fur, kibble, and an underlying note of anxiety? She wasn't sure. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant barking, the occasional plaintive meow, it was a world away from her silent house. She felt awkward, out of place, like an intruder in someone else's tragedy. A young volunteer, name tag reading he, greeted her with a bright, practiced smile. Looking to adopt today? Chloe chirped, her voice cutting through the shelter murmur. Sarah swallowed, her throat tight. Just looking, she managed, the words feeling inadequate. Chloe nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. Take your time. The cat rooms are down the hall, to the left. I'll find you when you're ready. There was a quiet wisdom in the statement. Sarah walked slowly, her boots squeaking slightly on the linoleum. Rows of cages lined the walls, each a small, contained world of longing. Bright eyes followed her, hopeful meows rose, paws reached through the bars. A fluffy orange tabby rolled onto its back. A sleek black cat rubbed insistently against the cage door. A tiny gray kitten batted a toy mouse with fierce concentration. Their energy, their need, felt overwhelming. Sarah's heart clenched, but it was a distant ache, muffled by the fog she carried. Then, she turned a corner, into a slightly quieter alcove, a space designated for senior cats, according to a small, handwritten sign. The hopeful energy here was different, tinged with a kind of weary patience. And that's when she saw her. In the last cage, bottom row, furthest from the door, sat a cat who seemed carved from shadow and dust. Not black, but a deep, smoky gray, like storm clouds gathering at twilight. Her fur was thick, but slightly unkempt, lacking the glossy sheen of the younger cats. She wasn't sleeping, nor was she watching Sarah with eager intensity. She was simply there, sitting upright, paws tucked neatly beneath her, gazing straight ahead at the blank wall opposite her cage, with a stillness that felt profound. Ancient. A small laminated card was clipped to her cage door. Sarah crouched, the cold of the linoleum seeping through her jeans, to read it. Name, Mittens, staff nickname. Age, estimated 16+ years. Intake, owner passed away. No family able to take her. Temperament, very quiet. Gentle. Prefers calm. Not fond of loud noises or sudden movements. Takes time to warm up. Medical notes, mild arthritis. Needs joint supplement daily. Dental monitoring advised. Overall health stable for age. 16+ years. The number hit Sarah with a soft thud. This cat, Mittens, had lived a whole lifetime, lost someone, lost them, and now sat here, waiting. Like Sarah, surrounded by memories in a place that wasn't home. Unlike the others reaching out, Mittens seemed contained, reserved, almost regal in her quiet isolation. There was no scar Sarah could see, no obvious sign of hardship beyond the simple fact of her presence here and her age. But it was her eyes that held Sarah captive. Large, round, an unusual shade of pale, luminous green, like moss on wet stone. They weren't dull, but they held a depth, a stillness, that spoke of years seen and losses endured. They looked tired. Not sleepy tired, but soul tired. The way Sarah felt when she looked in the mirror. Sarah didn't realize she'd reached out until her fingertips were a whisper away from the cold metal bars. She didn't tap, didn't make a coaxing sound. She just hovered, a silent offering of presence. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the cat's head turned. Not with a jerk, but with a deliberate, almost weary grace. Those ancient green eyes lifted, met Sarah's. There was no fear, no immediate curiosity, just a long, assessment. Sarah held her breath. The shelter sounds faded, the barking, the chatter from the front desk, the hum of the lights, narrowing down to this single point of connection, across the bars, across the chasm of their separate loneliness. Mittens blinked. A slow, deliberate closing and opening of those luminous eyes. Not a greeting, not a dismissal, just an acknowledgement. A tiny, silent signal in the vast quiet. And then, the cat did something unexpected. She didn't look away. She didn't retreat to the back of the cage. She simply held Sarah's gaze, that profound stillness settling around her again, but now, it felt different. It felt shared. Sarah's hand didn't move. She stayed crouched, the cold floor forgotten, the hollow ache in her chest suddenly pulsing. Not with the sharp stab of grief, but with something else. Something fragile and terrifying and utterly new. It wasn't joy, not yet. It wasn't even hope, not quite. It was the faintest tremor deep within the frozen ground of her heart, the quietest shift, like the first, almost imperceptible crack in thick winter ice, signaling that beneath the numbness, something might still feel. Something might still begin. The silence between them wasn't hollow anymore. It was full, waiting. The drive home felt unreal, like moving through thick syrup. Rain streaked the windshield, blurring the gray world outside into watery smears of color. Beside Sarah, in a battered cardboard carrier the shelter provided, Mittens was utterly silent. Not a meow, not a rustle, just profound stillness, radiating from the carrier like cold air. Sarah kept glancing over, half expecting the carrier to be empty, a figment conjured by her desperate loneliness. But the solid weight on the passenger seat, the faint scent of shelter disinfectant mixed with something earthier, muskier, confirmed it was real. What have I done? The thought buzzed, insistent, beneath the drumming rain on the car roof, bringing this ancient creature, steeped in her own loss, into her own tomb-quiet house? It felt impulsive, reckless, like throwing a lit match into a room full of dry tinder, unsure if it would ignite warmth or just consume everything faster. Chloe, the shelter volunteer, had been cautiously encouraging, her eyes softening when Sarah pointed to Mitten's cage. "Oh, Mittens," Chloe had murmured, her voice dropping, losing its bright chirp. "She's a special one. Been here longer than most seniors. Came in after her person, an elderly gentleman, passed peacefully in his sleep. Neighbors found her, sitting by his chair, wouldn't eat. Family lived far away, couldn't take her." Chloe had sighed, a soft, weary sound. She doesn't make it easy, but she feels things deeply. Takes time. A lot of time. The paperwork felt endless. Forms detailing Mitten's age, her mild arthritis, the daily joint supplement she needed, a tiny green pill tucked into a special paste. Sarah's hand shook slightly, signing her name. Sarah Evans. Responsible party. The weight of it, the commitment to another fragile life, pressed down on her already burdened shoulders. She bought the recommended food, the supplements, a simple litter box, a worn-looking scratching post donated to the shelter. Mittens watched it all from the carrier, those pale green eyes observing, unreadable. Now, standing in her own foyer, the carrier placed gently on the polished wood floor, the silence felt heavier than ever. The familiar scent of lavender polish and dust was now underscored by the new smells, the chemical tang of the carrier, the dry, slightly fishy odor of the senior cat food, and Mitten's own quiet, musky presence. Turned, her knees protesting on the hard floor, and slowly, carefully latched the carrier door. She didn't open it fully, just cracked it, creating an exit, an invitation. Then she sat back, giving space. Minutes ticked by. The only sounds were the rain outside, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the distant kitchen, and Sarah's own heartbeat, loud in her ears. Nothing moved inside the carrier. No curious sniff emerged. It was as if the cat had simply vanished into the shadows within. Sarah stayed put. She remembered Chloe's words. Takes time. She remembered the profound stillness in Mitten's gaze at the shelter. This wasn't a kitten bounding into adventure. This was a soul, displaced, grieving, assessing a potential threat. Or perhaps just too weary to care. Sarah felt a pang of foolishness. Had she projected her own need onto this cat? Imagined a connection that wasn't there? The familiar ache of loneliness, sharper now, mingled with a new wave of doubt. She leaned her head back against the cool wall, closing her eyes. The image of her mother's empty chair, the open book, flashed behind her eyelids. The soft, almost imperceptible, scritch. Sarah's eyes flew open. A single smoky gray paw, claws carefully sheathed, had emerged from the carrier's darkness. It rested tentatively on the polished wood floor, testing the surface. Then, slowly, deliberately, the rest of Mittens materialized. She didn't slink. She didn't bolt. She flowed out, low to the ground, a silent gray wraith emerging into the dim foyer light. She paused, completely still, her body a tense line, ears swiveling like delicate radar dishes, taking in the new dimensions, the new smells, the new silences of this place. Her luminous green eyes scanned the hallway, The stairs, the closed doors, finally landing on Sarah, who held her breath. Mittens didn't approach. She didn't retreat. She simply observed. Then, with infinite slowness, she turned her head, her gaze sweeping the room again, before she began to move. Not towards Sarah. Not towards the living room where Sarah's mother's presence lingered strongest. Instead, Mittens moved with a stiff, slightly arthritic gait towards the darkest corner of the foyer, where an old, heavy coat stand cast long shadows. She vanished behind it, disappearing into the gloom, becoming part of the furniture. Sarah let out the breath she'd been holding. Her shoulders slumped. Not rejection, not acceptance. Just existence. Parallel existence in the same hollow space. She left the carrier door open, placed a small bowl of water and another of the senior kibble near the coat stand, not too close, and retreated to the kitchen. She made herself tea, the ritual automatic, her hands moving while her mind churned. The silence, now inhabited, felt different. Not just empty, but watched. It was unsettling, somehow less desolate than before. Days blurred into a fragile, tentative routine. Sarah went to work, came home. Mittens remained a shadow. Food and water in the corner bowl were consumed meticulously, always when Sarah wasn't in the room. The litter box, placed discreetly in a downstairs bathroom, was used. But the cat herself? She was a ghost. Sarah would catch glimpses, a gray tail disappearing around a corner, the reflective glint of eyes from under the sofa in the rarely used formal dining room, a faint indentation on the rug behind the coat stand in the morning. She learned to move quietly, to avoid sudden noises, to speak in soft murmurs if she spoke at all. The house became a place of hushed footsteps and held breaths. One rainy evening, exhausted after a day filled with the hollow ache of meaningless tasks, Sarah sank into the worn velvet armchair in the living room. Her chair, not her mother's wingback. She picked up a book, but the words swam on the page. The silence pressed in, heavy with memory. A wave of grief, sharp and fresh, washed over her. Tears welled, hot and insistent. She didn't fight them. She let them fall, silent tracks down her cheeks, her breath hitching in the quiet room. She felt foolish, crying in front of a cat who wasn't even visible, who probably didn't care. The loneliness felt absolute, a vast ocean with her adrift in the center. A soft sound, not a meow, but a low, almost inaudible MRT. Sarah froze, her tears suspended. She hadn't imagined it. Slowly, she turned her head. From the doorway, half hidden in shadow, two pale green eyes watched her. Mittens. She was sitting upright, her smoky fur blending with the gloom, her gaze fixed on Sarah's face. Not judging, not afraid, just watching. Seeing the tears, seeing the raw, unguarded grief Sarah usually kept buried beneath a facade of weary competence. Sarah didn't move, didn't wipe her tears away. She just met that ancient, knowing gaze. Minutes passed. The only sound was the soft patter of rain on the window pane and Sarah's own shaky breaths slowly evening out. Mittens didn't come closer, but she didn't disappear either. She simply remained, a silent witness to the breaking. And in that shared stillness, that quiet acknowledgement of pain, Sarah felt a tiny, unexpected flicker. Not happiness, but the minuscule lessening of the crushing isolation. Something had seen her. The next breakthrough was even smaller, yet seismic in its implication. Sarah started placing Mittens' food bowl not in the foyer corner, but just outside the doorway to the living room, where Sarah often sat in the evenings. It was a subtle shift, an invitation into the shared space, however peripherally. For days, Mittens would wait until Sarah left the room or turned her back before approaching the bowl. Sarah pretended not to notice, reading her book, staring into the middle distance. One night, Sarah was engrossed in a particularly dense paragraph, her brow furrowed. She sensed, rather than saw, movement at the edge of her vision. She kept perfectly still, barely breathing. Mittens emerged from the hallway shadows. Not slinking, walking with that deliberate, stiff-legged gait. She paused, looked directly at Sarah for a long moment, those green eyes unblinking. Sarah kept her gaze lowered to her book, her heart pounding a quiet drum solo against her ribs. Mittens took another step, then another. She reached the food bowl, just a few feet from Sarah's chair. She didn't crouch immediately. She stood beside it, her gaze still fixed on Sarah. And then, slowly, deliberately, she blinked. A long, slow, closing and opening of her eyes. A cat's gesture of trust, of saying, "I see you, and I am not afraid right now." Sarah's breath caught. She didn't dare move. She met Mittens' gaze, and, tentatively, deliberately blinked back. Slow, measured. "I see you too." Only then did Mittens lower her head and begin to eat. Not hurriedly, with a quiet dignity. But she, right there, in the same room as Sarah, while Sarah sat, utterly still, tears pricking her eyes again, but for a completely different reason. The crack in the ice, widening. The following week brought a new ritual. Sarah discovered Mittens had a particular fondness for the patch of weak afternoon sunlight that fell onto the rug near the bay window in the living room, away from her mother's chair. Sarah started sitting on the floor nearby, not too close, reading or just sipping tea. Mittens would appear, like smoke coalescing, and settle into the sunbeam. She'd curl up, tucking her paws neatly beneath her, her eyes closing to slits, but Sarah could feel the awareness, the quiet observation. Sometimes, Mittens would stretch, a long, slow unfolding that revealed the slight stiffness in her hind legs, before settling again with a soft sigh. One afternoon, Sarah was sitting cross-legged on the rug, sorting through a box of old photographs she'd been avoiding. Pictures of her mother, smiling before the slow fade of illness. The familiar ache settled in her chest, a dull throb. She held a photo of her mother laughing in a garden, sunlight catching the silver in her hair. Tears threatened again, but she swallowed them down. She placed the photo carefully aside, her hand trembling slightly. Blood pressure, warm and unexpected, on her thigh. Sarah looked down. Mittens had uncurled from her sunbeam. She had silently crossed the short distance between them. Now, she stood beside Sarah, leaning her small, warm weight against Sarah's leg. Her head wasn't raised for petting. She wasn't rubbing. She was simply leaning. A solid, quiet presence against Sarah's body. A grounding weight. Her fur, soft and thick, radiated a surprising warmth through the fabric of Sarah's jeans. Sarah froze. This was the first time Mittens had initiated contact. The first time she had deliberately chosen proximity. Sarah held her breath, afraid to move, afraid to shatter this impossible moment. She slowly lowered her hand from the photograph box. Not reaching to touch Mittens. Just letting it rest on her own knee, palm up, an open invitation. Mittens didn't move away. She didn't look up. She just stood there, leaning, her warm flank pressed against Sarah's leg, her breathing a soft, steady rhythm in the quiet room. The weight was astonishing. Not physically heavy, but emotionally, profoundly anchoring. It was a silent declaration, "I am here." You are not alone in this. Sarah felt the tight knot of grief in her chest, the one that had been her constant companion for months, loosen just a fraction. Not gone, but shared, felt momentarily by the warm, quiet pressure leaning against her. Sunlight slanted through the window, dust motes dancing in the golden beams, falling across the rug, across the box of memories, and across the smoky gray cat, offering silent comfort to the woman whose tears, for the first time in a long time, felt less like drowning and more like release. The silence wasn't hollow anymore. It was filled with the soft sound of breathing and the fragile, growing warmth of trust. The fragile peace, the quiet rhythm they'd established, felt like sunlight on thin ice. Beautiful, precious, terrifyingly breakable. Mittens leaning against her leg, the warm weight, the shared sunbeam silences, these weren't just moments. They were lifelines Sarah hadn't known she needed. She started talking to the cat, softly, murmuring inconsequential things about her day, the weather, the stubborn stain on her favorite mug. It wasn't conversation, it was companionship, a voice filling the hollow spaces. Mittens rarely reacted overtly, but her presence, her slow blinks, felt like listening. Sarah found herself looking forward to coming home, not just to escape the world, but to the possibility of that warm pressure against her leg, the quiet companionship in the fading light. She bought a soft, plush bed, placing it near the favored sunbeam. Mittens ignored it for days, preferring the rug. One afternoon, Sarah came home to find the cat curled tightly within its plush confines, a small gray comma of contentment. It felt like a victory, a tiny flag planted on the landscape of their shared existence. Sarah started the joint supplement, carefully hiding the tiny green pill in a smear of pungent paste on Mittens' food. The cat ate around it, meticulously, for 3 days. On the 4th, Sarah held her breath, watching as Mittens, after a long, considering look, finally licked the paste, pill and all. Another fragile bridge crossed. But the house, Sarah's mother's house, held its own memories, its own geography of loss. And Mittens, it seemed, had her own map, drawn in invisible ink only she could see. It started subtly, almost dismissible. Sarah would be reading in her chair, Mittens dozing in her bed nearby. A soft sound, a rhythmic scritch, 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 would drift from the hallway. Sarah would glance up. Mittens would be awake, ears pricked, staring intently towards the foyer, specifically towards the wall near the bottom of the stairs. The first few times, Sarah dismissed it. An itch? A random claw against the baseboard? She'd murmur, "Everything okay, Mitts?" The cat would eventually settle, her gaze lingering on the spot before slowly closing her eyes again. Then, it became a ritual. Every evening, as dusk painted the rooms in long, blue shadows, Mittens would leave her plush bed. She'd walk, with her stiff, deliberate gait, down the hall. Not towards her food bowl, not towards Sarah. She'd stop at that specific section of wall, near the stairs, where the faded floral wallpaper met the dark wood wainscoting. She'd sit utterly still, for a long moment, her smoky fur blending into the gloom. Then she'd lift one front paw and begin. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Not frantic, not destructive, purposeful, deliberate. Her claws, carefully unsheathed, would make soft, insistent tracks against the wallpaper, always the same spot, about a foot above the baseboard. She'd do it for several minutes, pausing, listening, then starting again. It wasn't playful. It held an intensity, a focus, that felt unnerving. Afterward, she'd sit back, stare at the wall, then slowly, almost reluctantly, return to the living room, often curling up, but not truly relaxing. Her eyes, those ancient green pools, would remain watchful, distant. Sarah tried everything gentle. She placed a brand new, enticing scratching post directly beside the spot. Mittens ignored it, stepping around it to reach her wall. Sarah tried softly discouraging her. Here's your post. Mittens would pause, look at Sarah, her expression unreadable, then turn back and resume her scratching, a quiet persistence that felt like a rebuke. Sarah felt a flicker of frustration, quickly swallowed by a deeper unease. What was in that wall? Or, what did Mittens think was in it? The scratching wasn't the only thing. Sarah noticed Mittens' intense aversion to the closed door of her mother's bedroom. It remained shut, a barrier Sarah herself hadn't crossed since the day the hospice bed was removed. The air around it felt thick, charged with unspoken grief. Mittens wouldn't go near it. If Sarah walked down the hall towards it, Mittens, even if she'd been following her, would stop dead, flatten herself slightly, and refuse to move closer. Her eyes, fixed on the door, held not fear, but a profound wariness, a deep-seated refusal. It mirrored Sarah's own avoidance, an uncomfortable reflection. One rainy Tuesday evening, the tension coiled tight. Sarah had received a call from her aunt, her mother's sister. A well-meaning call, probing about Sarah's plans. "The house is too big for you, dear. Full of memories. Maybe it's time? You're young, you need to move forward." The words, intended as kindness, felt like shards of glass scraping against raw nerves. Move forward? Forward felt like abandoning her mother, abandoning the last tangible connection. The call left Sarah feeling hollowed out, adrift in a fresh wave of grief mixed with defensive anger. She paced the living room, restless energy crackling off her. Mittens watched from her plush bed, her usual stillness replaced by a subtle tension, her ears flicking with each sharp turn Sarah made. The familiar dusk settled, painting the hall in deepening blues. Like clockwork, Mittens rose. Sarah stopped pacing, watching her. The cat moved down the hall, stopped at the spot. She sat, stared, then lifted her paw. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound, usually a background murmur, suddenly grated on Sarah's raw nerves. It felt like an intrusion, a physical manifestation of the restless, unresolved pain churning inside her. The call, the pressure to move on, the silent specter of her mother's room. Mittens' inexplicable ritual, it all collided. "Stop it!" The words burst out, sharper, louder than she intended. "Just stop scratching the wall. What is wrong with that spot?" Mittens froze. Paw suspended midair. Her head whipped around, those luminous green eyes wide, fixed on Sarah. Not cowering, not guilty, startled, but beneath it, Sarah saw something else. A flash of defiance? It was gone in an instant, replaced by that familiar, impenetrable stillness. But the air between them crackled. The fragile trust, painstakingly built over weeks, felt suddenly brittle. Mittens lowered her paw. She didn't resume scratching. She didn't look back at the wall. She simply turned, slowly, deliberately, and walked away. Not back to her plush bed. Not towards Sarah. She walked past the living room doorway, past the kitchen, and vanished into the shadowed recesses of the rarely used dining room, a place she usually avoided. Silence crashed down. Thicker, heavier, more suffocating than the silence before Mittens arrived. Sarah stood frozen, the echo of her own sharp voice ringing in her ears. Regret, cold and sharp, flooded her. She hadn't just yelled at a cat. She'd yelled at her silent companion, her fellow traveler in grief, the one creature who seemed to understand the weight of quiet rooms and lingering absence. She'd yelled at the only living thing who had leaned against her leg when the tears fell. She sank onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands. The frustration was gone, replaced by a crushing wave of shame and renewed loneliness. What had she done? The scratching, the wall. It suddenly seemed insignificant. A quirk, a harmless, if puzzling, habit, and she'd shattered the delicate piece over it. She thought of Mittens, huddled alone in the dark dining room, her ancient eyes holding that fleeting flash of what? Betrayal? Sarah remembered Chloe's words. She feels things deeply. Hours passed. Sarah didn't move. The house felt colder, emptier than it had in months. She strained to hear any sound from the dining room, any rustle, any sign of life. Nothing. Just the oppressive silence, pressing down, accusing her. Had she destroyed the only good thing she'd managed to build since her mother left? The thought was a physical pain. Finally, driven by desperation, Sarah rose. She moved slowly, quietly, towards the dining room doorway. The room was dark, lit only by the faint streetlight glow filtering through the heavy curtains. She peered in. Mittens wasn't hiding under the table or behind the china cabinet. She was sitting upright, perfectly still, in the center of the large, ornate rug. She wasn't looking at Sarah. She was staring straight ahead, towards the wall, where a large, framed landscape painting hung, a scene of mountains Sarah's parents had bought on their honeymoon. Her posture wasn't cowed. It was rigid, alert, almost waiting. Her tail, usually curled neatly around her, was extended slightly behind her, the tip twitching, just once, with a tension Sarah hadn't seen before. Her ears were pricked forward, not flattened, but intensely focused, as if listening to something far beyond the walls of the room, or perhaps deep within them. Sarah stood in the doorway, unseen, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't fear. This wasn't submission. This felt different. Ancient. Primal. Mittens looked protective. Guarding. Against what? The wall? The painting? The silence itself? The weight of the past pressing in from all sides? The cat didn't turn. Didn't acknowledge Sarah's presence. She remained frozen in that posture of intense vigilance, a small, smoky sentinel in the dark, staring into the void Sarah herself was too afraid to face. The comfortable rhythm was shattered. The quiet companionship fractured. In its place, a chilling question hung in the air, thicker than the dust motes dancing in the sliver of streetlight, echoing louder than Sarah's sharp words. What exactly are we both sensing in this house that refuses to rest? The scratching wasn't just a habit. It was a signal. And Sarah, in her own storm of grief, had finally been forced to truly hear it. The mystery wasn't outside the walls anymore. It was inside, coiled tight in the stillness of an old cat's unwavering gaze, and in the frantic beating of Sarah's own frightened heart. The warmth was gone. Only the watchful cold remained. What happened next wasn't just about a cat and a wall. It was about confronting the ghosts they both carried, before the silence consumed them completely. The silence that followed Sarah's discovery of Mittens, rigid, watchful, in the dark dining room, wasn't peaceful. It was charged, thrumming with unspoken questions and the aftershock of her own outburst. The comfortable rhythm they'd built, sunbeams and quiet companionship, felt like a distant memory. Now, The house felt like a vessel holding two separate storms, Sarah's churning grief and confusion, and Mitten's ancient, inscrutable vigilance. The wall, the scratching, it wasn't just a quirk anymore. It was a focal point, a wound in the fabric of the house, or perhaps in Mitten's memory. Sarah spent a restless night. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of wind outside, felt amplified. She strained to hear Mittens, but the cat remained hidden, a silent, brooding presence in the shadows. Guilt gnawed at Sarah. She'd yelled, broken the fragile trust, over something she didn't understand. Yet, the image of Mittens sitting sentinel, staring into the dark, wouldn't leave her. It wasn't random. It meant something. To Mittens, it was vital. The next morning, Sarah moved through the house like a ghost herself. She placed Mittens' food and water near the dining room doorway, a silent peace offering. Hours later, it remained untouched. The untouched bowl was a knife to Sarah's heart. Mittens hadn't just withdrawn physically, she'd withdrawn completely. The connection, so painstakingly built, felt severed. Sarah tried sitting quietly in the living room, projecting calm she didn't feel. Nothing. The house felt colder, emptier than it ever had before Mittens arrived. The hollow ache was back, intensified by the loss of the warmth she'd only just begun to rely on. 2 days passed. Mittens emerged only to use the litter box, vanishing immediately afterward. She ignored her plush bed, her sunbeam, her food unless Sarah was completely absent. The untouched joint supplement paste mocked Sarah from its dish. The silence was no longer shared, it was a wall. Sarah felt desperation rising, a panicky sense that she was losing the only anchor she had, and it was her own fault. She couldn't undo the yell, but she could try to understand the why. The scratching spot. It called to her now, not with annoyance, but with a terrible magnetic pull. It was the key, the source of Mittens' obsession, and the catalyst for the rupture. Late on the third afternoon, the light fading early under a heavy gray sky, Sarah stood in the hallway, staring at the section of wall near the stairs. The faded floral wallpaper, once elegant, now just looked tired and worn. Mittens' persistent scratching had left faint, but undeniable marks. A patch about the size of Sarah's hand, the paper slightly roughened, the underlying plaster faintly scored in parallel lines. Sarah ran her fingertips over it. It felt ordinary. Just a wall. What lay beneath it? Plumbing? Wiring? Or something else? Memories surfaced, unbidden. Her mother, years ago, complaining about a draft near the stairs. Her father, practical and handy, tapping the wall, muttering about old houses settling. Had he patched something? Installed insulation? It was so long ago, the details fuzzy. But the spot? Mittens was fixated on this exact spot. Was it possible, somehow? Mittens sensed something? Remembered something from her previous life with the old gentleman? A sound? A smell associated with that spot? The thought felt absurd. It was the only thread she had. Mittens had been brought here, to a house saturated with a different grief, yet she'd latched onto this specific location. It had to mean something to her. Sarah needed to know. For Mittens. For herself. To bridge the chasm her anger had created. Resolve, cold and shaky, solidified within her. She couldn't live with this wall, literal and metaphorical, between them. She needed to see what was behind it. Not metaphorically. Physically. Tools. Her father's old toolbox was buried in the basement. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight as she descended the creaking stairs, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and forgotten things. She found the toolbox, heavy, coated in a fine gray powder. Inside, amidst tangles of wire and unfamiliar fittings, was a small pry bar, its metal cold to the touch, and a hammer. Back in the hallway, the air felt charged. Sarah placed a drop cloth carefully on the polished floor beneath the scratching spot. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. This felt like violation, like tearing open a wound. But it also felt like the only path forward. She positioned the thin edge of the pry bar into a tiny gap in the wallpaper seam, right in the center of Mitten's focused area. She hesitated, glancing towards the dining room doorway. No sign of Mittens, only silence. With a small, decisive pressure, she pushed the bar in. The old wallpaper, brittle with age, gave way with a dry crackle. Plaster dust puffed into the air, smelling faintly chalky, ancient. Sarah flinched, but kept going, working the bar gently, peeling back a section of the damaged wallpaper. Underneath, the plaster was indeed scored, confirming Mitten's persistent attention. She used the hammer lightly, tapping the pry bar, carefully chipping away at the damaged plaster. It crumbled, surprisingly easily, revealing the wooden lath beneath, thin strips running horizontally. Her heart hammered against her ribs. What was she expecting? Pipes? Mice? A hidden treasure? It felt ridiculous, yet the tension was unbearable. She worked more carefully now, removing loose plaster, widening the hole, trying not to damage the lath unnecessarily. The hole was roughly the size of a dinner plate now, exposing the dark cavity behind the wall. Dust motes swirled in the weak hallway light filtering in. Sarah grabbed her flashlight, its beam cutting a stark white circle into the darkness within the wall cavity. She leaned closer, dreading what she might see. No pipes, no wires, no nest. Instead, nestled amongst the dust and cobwebs, tucked neatly between two wooden laths, was a small rectangular object. Wrapped in faded blue cloth, tied with a thin, crumbling string. Sarah froze. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't infrastructure. This was deliberate, hidden. With trembling fingers, ignoring the dust coating her hands, she reached into the cool darkness of the cavity. Her fingertips brushed the rough fabric. Carefully, gently, she worked it loose from its resting place, dislodging a small cascade of plaster dust. She drew it out, cradling the small, surprisingly heavy bundle in her palms. It felt solid, tense. She sank onto her knees right there on the drop cloth in the hallway, the pry bar and hammer forgotten beside her. Her fingers fumbled with the brittle string. It snapped easily. Slowly, reverently, she unfolded the soft blue cloth, like opening a long-lost letter. Inside, nestled within the folds, were two objects. The first was a small, worn leather collar. Tiny, clearly sized for a cat. The buckle was tarnished brass, the leather supple but cracked with age. Stitched onto it, in slightly faded thread, was a name, Oscar. Not Mittens. The second object was a photograph. A small, square, black and white snapshot, the edges slightly curled. Sarah lifted it, her hands shaking violently now, bringing it into the light. It showed an elderly man, perhaps in his 80s, with kind eyes crinkled at the corners and a gentle smile. He was sitting in a sturdy armchair, sunlight streaming through a window beside him, and curled contentedly in his lap, a small, sleek, jet-black cat. The cat's eyes were half closed in bliss, one paw resting possessively on the man's forearm. The man's hand, gnarled with age, rested gently on the cat's back. The love, the absolute peace and contentment radiating from the image was palpable. It was a moment frozen outside of time, a perfect snapshot of devotion. Sarah stared. The black cat, the elderly gentleman, Mitten's previous owner. But Mittens was gray, not black. And her name wasn't Oscar. Confusion warred with the overwhelming emotional punch of the photograph. Who was Mittens? Where did she fit in? A soft sound, barely a whisper, made Sarah look up. Mittens stood in the hallway entrance. Not hiding, not wary. She stood fully in the light, her smoky gray fur almost luminous. She was utterly still, her entire being focused on the objects in Sarah's hands. Her luminous green eyes, wide, unblinking, were fixed on the photograph, then shifted to the small leather collar. Her breath seemed to have stopped. Slowly, deliberately, Mittens took a step forward, then another. Her stiff gait seemed forgotten. She moved with a quiet, almost reverent purpose, closing the distance between them. She stopped inches from Sarah's knees, her gaze locked on the photograph in Sarah's trembling hand. She didn't meow. She didn't try to touch it, simply threw it, and then Sarah saw it. The recognition, not in a human way, but in the deep, profound stillness that settled over the cat. In the way her body seemed to soften, the rigid vigilance melting away, replaced by an immeasurable sadness, a deep, ancient knowing. Those green eyes, usually so guarded, filled with a sheen of moisture, a silent, impossible welling of grief that mirrored Sarah's own tears now streaming freely down her face. Mittens lowered her head, not submissively, but as if bowing to the memory. A low sound vibrated from her chest, not a deeper, softer, a rumbling sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. It was a sound of loss, of remembrance. Sarah understood. Mittens hadn't been scratching at a wall. She'd been scratching at a tomb. A secret compartment holding the last tangible remnants of Oscar, her predecessor, the cat who had owned the elderly gentleman's lap, the cat whose scent, whose memory, lingered in the hidden space behind the wall. Mittens, the quiet observer, the survivor, had known. She'd remembered. Perhaps she'd seen the gentleman hide it, heard the faint sounds behind the plaster, sensed the presence of the past concentrated in that spot. Her scratching wasn't destruction, it was communication. An attempt to reach, to uncover, to acknowledge the ghost that shared her displacement. The ghost of the cat who came before. Mittens lifted her head. Her gaze, filled with that impossible, knowing sorrow, shifted from the photograph and met Sarah's tear-filled eyes. It wasn't just grief for Oscar Sarah saw reflected there. It was grief for her own lost person, the gentleman. It was grief for displacement, for silence, for the unbearable weight of being the one left behind. It was a mirror held up to Sarah's own soul, reflecting the raw, unvarnished truth of her loss. In that shared gaze, across the small leather collar, across the faded photograph, across the dusty hole in the wall, something broke. Not just the plaster, but the dam holding back Sarah's ocean of grief. A sob, raw and wrenching, tore from her throat. Not just for her mother, but for the universal ache of loss, for the quiet dignity of Mittens' sorrow, for the unseen history embedded in the walls around them. She wept, great heaving sobs that shook her body, her tears dripping onto the faded blue cloth, onto the photograph of a man and a cat who were gone. Mittens didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. She took one last step forward, closing the final distance. She didn't lean against Sarah's leg this time. Instead, she gently, slowly rested her forehead against Sarah's trembling knee. A small, solid point of contact. Warm fur against cool skin. A silent offering, not of comfort, exactly, but of shared burden. I know, the touch seemed to say. I know this pain. You are not alone in this darkness. Sarah lowered her hand, the photograph still clutched in her fingers, and tentatively, reverently rested it on her own beside Mitten's bowed head. Her other hand, trembling, lifted. Not to grab, but to hover in invitation. Mittens didn't move away. Sarah's fingertips, dust-covered tightly, brushed the top of the cat's smoky gray head, tracing the soft fur between her ears. Mittens didn't purr, but she pressed her forehead more firmly against Sarah's knee. And she closed her eyes. A slow, deliberate blink, a surrender, an acceptance, not just of the touch, but of the shared sorrow, the unveiled truth, the broken wall between them. The silence now was filled only with the sound of Sarah's weeping, the soft rhythm of Mitten's breathing, and the echo of two lost souls, finally, truly, seeing each other across the ruins of the past. The mystery was solved, not with a shout, but with a sigh, a touch, and the quiet recognition of grief's universal language. The breaking point wasn't an end, but a terrible, necessary opening. And in the raw space it left behind, something new, fragile, and drenched in understanding began to breathe. The dust settled, literally. Fine plaster powder coated the drop cloth. Sarah's jeans, even Mitten's smoky fur like a ghostly patina. The hole in the wall, a jagged mouth open to the past, gaped silently. But the silence now, permeating the hallway where Sarah knelt. Mitten's forehead pressed against her knee, was different. Not heavy, not charged, but cleansed. Raw, like air after a thunderstorm, scoured clean by the torrent of shared tears. Sarah's sobs subsided, leaving her hollowed out, trembling, but strangely lighter. The weight of the secret, the mystery that had coiled around Mitten's nightly ritual, was gone. Replaced by the tangible reality of the small leather collar, the faded photograph, resting on her thigh beside the bowed gray head. Mittens didn't move. Her warmth, the solid pressure against Sarah's knee, was an anchor in the emotional whirlpool. She simply breathed, a slow, steady rhythm, her eyes closed, as if absorbing the profound shift in the atmosphere, the release of a tension she'd carried for months, perhaps years. Slowly, carefully, Sarah lifted her hand from Mitten's head. The cat didn't flinch. She opened her luminous green eyes, lifting her head just enough to meet Sarah's gaze. The ancient sorrow was still there, deep as a well, but the frantic vigilance, the watchful rigidity, had dissolved. There was a quiet acceptance, a profound weariness, and something else, a fragile thread of peace. Sarah saw her own exhaustion, her own tentative relief, mirrored in those depths. They had unmasked the ghost. Together, Sarah gathered the small blue cloth bundle, the collar, the photograph. She stood, her legs stiff from kneeling, the ache in her muscles a grounding counterpoint to the emotional freefall. Mittens watched her. With a soft sigh, rose too. She didn't retreat into the shadows. She stood beside Sarah, looking not at the hole in the wall, but at the objects in Sarah's hands. "Come on, Mitz," Sarah murmured, her voice hoarse from crying, but softer than it had been in weeks. Let's find a better place for these." She didn't go to the living room. She walked, Mittens padding stiffly but purposefully beside her, down the hall towards the closed door. Her mother's door. Sarah stopped before it, the familiar barrier of grief. Mittens stopped too, her posture alert but no longer wary, no longer refusing. She looked at the door, then up at Sarah, waiting. Sarah took a deep, shuddering breath. The weight of the hidden past she held, Oscar's story, Mittens' silent vigil, gave her a strange courage. This door, too, held secrets, memories. But perhaps, like the wall, it needed acknowledging, not hiding. Not forever. Slowly, her hand trembling, she reached out and turned the cool brass doorknob. The click echoed loudly in the quiet hall. She pushed the door open, just a crack, letting the stale, lavender-scented air mingle with the dust of the hallway. She didn't go in. Not yet. But the barrier was breached. Instead, she turned to the small, polished side table that stood beside the door. It held a dusty lamp, a forgotten coaster. Sarah carefully, reverently, unfolded the blue cloth again. She placed the small leather collar, Oscar, on the polished wood. Beside it, she propped the photograph, the image of the elderly gentleman and his beloved black cat, facing the room beyond the door, facing the space her mother had occupied. A small memorial, not hidden. Mittens stepped closer, sniffed delicately at the collar, then looked at the photograph for a long moment. She didn't touch it. She didn't meow. She simply sat, her tail curling neatly around her paws, gazing at the image. She turned her head, looked up at Sarah, and blinked. Slowly, deliberately. "Thank you." The following days were a quiet recalibration. Sarah patched the hole in the hallway wall carefully, smoothing new plaster over the lath, a physical closure. The scratching post remained untouched nearby, a silent testament to Mittens' true intent. The ritual never resumed. The spot near the stairs, once charged with mystery, was just a wall again, albeit one with a fresh patch of plaster slowly drying under a layer of primer. Mittens slowly returned. Not to the wary ghost she'd been before the wall, nor instantly to the cat who'd leaned against Sarah's leg. It was a new chapter. She began eating regularly again, accepting her joint supplement paste with only a token hesitation, a flicker of her old dignity. She reclaimed her plush bed near the sunbeam, but her sleep seemed deeper, more peaceful. The watchful tension, the sense of being perpetually braced, had eased. Her eyes, while still holding their ancient depth, seemed clearer, less clouded by an unseen burden. The biggest change was in her proximity. She didn't instantly resume leaning against Sarah, but she began choosing to be near. She'd curl up on the rug while Sarah read, closer than before. She'd sit in the doorway of the kitchen while Sarah cooked, observing the mundane rituals of human life. When Sarah sat on the floor sorting through another box of her mother's things, this time without the paralyzing wave of grief, Mittens would settle nearby, not touching, but present. A quiet companionship, built on shared understanding rather than tentative exploration. One crisp autumn afternoon, sunlight streaming golden through the bay window. Sarah sat on the sofa, a mug of tea cooling beside her. She wasn't reading. She was just sitting, watching the dust motes dance, reflecting. The frantic pressure she'd felt, the guilt, the desperate need to do something to fill the void had softened. Her aunt's call, the suggestion to sell, echoed differently now. The house wasn't just a tomb of memories anymore. It was a vessel holding her own story, her mother's story, and now, woven into its fabric, the quiet echo of an elderly gentleman and his beloved Oscar, witnessed by the dignified gray cat who shared Sarah's displacement. Moving forward didn't mean abandoning this space. It meant inhabiting it differently, honoring the past, but not being entombed by it. Mittens, napping peacefully in her sunbeam, her breathing a soft, steady rhythm, was proof that life, quiet, resilient, could continue amidst the echoes. Sarah picked up her phone. She scrolled past the real estate apps she'd downloaded in a moment of panicked uncertainty and opened her contacts. She found her aunt's number. Her thumb hovered. Then, she typed a message, simple, clear. "Hi, Aunt Carol. Thanks for your call the other day. I've been thinking. The house, it's where I need to be right now. There's still healing to do here. For me, and for someone else. Maybe we can talk soon?" Sarah. She hit send. The decision, the choice to stay, to face the quiet, felt solid. Grounded. Like Mittens' weight against her leg, but this time, the weight was her own resolve. Later that evening, Sarah stood before the open door of her mother's room. She hadn't entered yet, but the barrier was no longer absolute. She looked at the small memorial on the side table, Oscar's collar, the photograph catching the fading light. Mittens appeared beside her, sitting tall, her green eyes reflecting the soft glow from the room beyond. Sarah took a step, then another, crossing the threshold. The air was still thick with lavender and memory, but it no longer felt suffocating. It felt familiar. She walked slowly, touching the back of her mother's wingback chair, the smooth wood of the dresser. Mittens followed, her stiff gait cautious but curious, exploring this new, unveiled territory. She sniffed at the legs of the chair, unexpectedly, hopped up onto the seat cushion, the one her mother had favored. She turned once, twice, then settled, curling into a tight gray circle, her head resting on her paws. She didn't look at Sarah. She closed her eyes, as if claiming a spot long observed from a distance, finally finding a measure of peace within the room's lingering presence. Sarah watched, a lump forming in her throat. Not grief, but a profound, bittersweet gratitude. Mittens wasn't replacing her mother. She wasn't replacing Oscar. She was simply being. Finding her place in the ongoing story of this house, this life. And in doing so, she was showing Sarah how to do the same. Sarah didn't sit in her mother's chair. Not yet. But she pulled the small ottoman closer, sitting beside it, near Mittens. She didn't speak. She just sat in the quiet room, the scent of lavender and dust and warm cat fur surrounding her. The past was present, the losses were real, but the silence wasn't hollow. It was filled with the soft sound of a contented cat's breathing, the faint tick of a clock, the distant hum of the world outside, and the steady, quiet beat of her own heart, finally beginning to find its rhythm again in the space between memory and the fragile, resilient warmth of the now. The wall was repaired. The door was open. The ghosts were acknowledged. Life, in its quiet, persistent way, was gently, insistently moving forward. Winter arrived quietly, frosting the windows with delicate lace patterns, turning the world outside into a hushed, silver-blue dream. Inside the house, warmth lingered, not just from the old radiator's steady hum, but from something softer, quieter. A shift. Mittens had taken to sleeping on the foot of Sarah's bed. It had happened gradually. First, she'd curl up on the rug beside it, a shadow in the moonlight. Then, one particularly cold night, Sarah woke to the faintest dip in the mattress near her feet. She didn't move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. Mittens wasn't just near her now, she was with her. Trusting. Choosing. By mid-December, it was routine. Every night, after Sarah turned off the lamp, she'd hear the soft thump of Mittens landing on the quilt, the careful kneading of paws before settling into a warm, purring weight against her ankles. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental, like the last piece of a bridge finally clicking into place. One evening, Sarah sat cross-legged on the living room floor, wrapping presents, small things, mostly. A scarf for her aunt. A donation made in her mother's name to the local animal shelter. The radio played old holiday songs softly in the background, the kind her mother used to hum while baking. The scent of cinnamon tea steamed from her mug, mixing with the piney fragrance of the modest Christmas tree she'd put up in the corner. Mittens watched from her plush bed, eyes half-lidded, tail twitching occasionally at the crinkle of paper. She wasn't the kind of cat to attack ribbons or bat at ornaments. She observed with quiet dignity, as if approving of the ritual. Sarah reached for another gift, her fingers brushing against a small box tucked beneath the coffee table. She paused. It wasn't something she'd bought. A plain, unmarked cardboard box, slightly dusty, as if it had been pulled from a forgotten corner. She didn't remember putting it there. Curious, she tugged it free. It was light. No rattle when she shook it gently. She peeled back the tape, the sound loud in the quiet room. Mitten's ears pricked forward. Inside, nestled in yellowed tissue paper, was a tiny felt mouse. Not just any mouse. This one was handmade, stitched with care, its gray felt worn soft with age. One ear was slightly crumpled, and its black thread whiskers were frayed. The toy. Olaf. Sarah's breath caught. She turned it over in her palm. No note. No explanation. But she knew. This wasn't hers. It wasn't her mother's. And then, Mittens moved. Not with her usual slow deliberation, but with sudden, startling purpose. She stood, her green eyes fixed on the mouse in Sarah's hand. Her tail flicked once, twice. Then she stepped forward, her paws silent on the hardwood, until she was close enough to lower her head and sniff the tiny toy. The pause. A stillness. Then, a sound Sarah had never heard from her before, a soft, trilling meow, high and questioning. Almost young. Mittens nudged the mouse with her nose. Then again, more insistently. Sarah's throat tightened. She placed the toy on the floor between them. Mittens didn't pounce. She didn't bat at it like a kitten would. Instead, she circled it once, then sat, staring at it with an expression Sarah could only describe as recognition. And then, she lowered herself onto her belly, stretched one paw forward and touched the mouse. Just a tap. Gentle. Reverent. Sarah's vision blurred. This wasn't just a forgotten toy. This was Oscar's. It had to be. Hidden away somewhere in the house, tucked behind a baseboard or beneath a cabinet, undisturbed for years until Sarah, in her slow reclamation of the space, had unknowingly dislodged it. And now here it was, a relic from a life before hers, before Mittens, a tiny, tangible thread connecting them all. Mittens didn't play with it. She didn't carry it off or claim it as her own. She simply acknowledged it. Then, after a long moment, she looked up at Sarah, blinked slowly, and exhaled, a quiet, almost human sigh. I remember. Sarah reached out, her fingers trembling, and picked up the mouse again. It was so small, so ordinary, and yet it felt like holding a secret, a whisper from the past. She didn't put it back in the box. Instead, she placed it on the shelf beside Oscar's collar and the photograph, the trio now complete. A tiny memorial, a quiet testament to the lives that had woven through this house before hers. Mittens watched her do it. Then, with a soft she turned and padded back to her plush bed, curling up with her tail over her nose. At peace. Sarah sat back on her heels, staring at the shelf, the mouse, the collar, the photograph. And suddenly she understood. This wasn't just about the past. It was about what remained. The love that lingered in small, felt mice and worn leather. The way memories could settle into walls and floorboards, waiting to be found. The quiet, resilient truth that grief wasn't the end. It was just another kind of belonging. Mittens had known all along. And now, so did Sarah. She wiped her cheeks, smiling through the tears. Then she reached for the last gift on her list, a small, soft blanket, the color of storm clouds. She didn't wrap it. She carried it to Mitten's bed and draped it gently over the sleeping cat, tucking it around her like a whisper. A gift. A thank you. A promise. The house, once so full of silence, was full of something else now. Not answers. Not magic. Just warmth. And that, Sarah realized, was enough. Spring arrived, not with a fanfare, but with a slow, insistent unfurling. The frost lace on the windows melted into rivulets, revealing a world washed clean, tender green shoots pushing through the damp earth in Sarah's neglected garden. Sunlight, pale gold and hesitant at first, then bolder, warmer, began to flood the rooms of the old Victorian house, chasing the lingering shadows from the corners. The air, once thick with dust and memory, now carried the scent of wet earth, blooming hyacinths from a pot by the front door, and the comforting, musky warmth of an old cat. Mittens spent her days basking. She claimed the prime sunbeam, the one that now stretched further, warmer, across the living room rug. Her movements were slower, more deliberate. The mild arthritis Chloe had mentioned seemed a little more pronounced. Her jumps onto the sofa required a thoughtful pause, a gathering of strength. Sarah watched her, a familiar ache blooming in her own chest, different from the raw grief for her mother, yet just as profound. It was the quiet ache of witnessing time, of loving something fragile, knowing its season is finite. She'd set up Oscar's collar, the photograph, and the tiny felt mouse on a small shelf in the living room, not hidden, but honored. A quiet corner of remembrance. Mittens would sometimes pause there, gazing up, her green eyes soft, unreadable. She never tried to reach them. It was enough, Sarah sensed, for her to know they were there. Acknowledged. Part of the tapestry of the house. Life had settled into a rhythm, deep and resonant. Sarah still felt the echo of her mother in the creak of the stairs, the pattern of the china, the scent of lavender that clung stubbornly to the Afghan. But it was no longer a haunting. It was a presence, a gentle undercurrent. She'd finally opened all the windows in her mother's room, letting the spring air sweep through, carrying away the staleness. She'd even sat in the wingback chair, not for long, but enough to feel the shape of it, the memory held within its embrace, without being crushed by it. Mittens often joined her there, curled on the cushion, a quiet companion in the reclaimed space. One soft May evening, Sarah sat on the floor beside Mittens' plush bed. The cat was stretched out, her smoky fur warmed by the last of the sun, her breathing slow, rhythmic, peaceful. Sarah ran her fingers gently over the velvet soft fur between Mittens' ears, down the bridge of her nose. Mittens didn't open her eyes, but a deep, resonant purr rumbled from her chest, a vibration Sarah felt in her own bones. It wasn't the frantic purr of a kitten, but the slow, contented engine of a creature profoundly at ease. "Hey, old girl," Sarah murmured, her voice thick with an emotion too large for words. Gratitude. A love that had crept in so quietly, so unexpectedly, it had taken root before she'd even noticed it blooming. Mittens stretched, a long, luxurious unfolding that ended with one paw resting lightly, possessively, on Sarah's knee. Her eyes opened, those luminous green pools reflecting the golden light, and fixed on Sarah's face. There was no demand in them, no plea, just a deep, quiet knowing, an understanding that transcended words, species, even time itself. In that case, Sarah saw the entire journey reflected. The hollow silence of her grief, the rain-slicked shelter visit-driven by desperation, the ancient, soul-tired cat in the corner cage, the slow, tentative steps towards trust, shattered by a wall, a mystery, a sharp word. The breaking open, the raw revelation of Oscar's hidden treasures. The shared grief that became shared solace. The quiet reclamation of space, both physical and emotional. The discovery of the tiny mouse, the final piece of a puzzle connecting past and present. The deepening bond, forged not in grand gestures, but in shared sunbeams, the weight of a head on a knee, the soft rumble of a purr in the dark. This wasn't just about rescuing a cat. Mittens had rescued her, dragged her, kicking and screaming through her grief at times, back into the land of the living. Shown her that grief wasn't a cage, but a landscape to be navigated with room for memory, for love, for new beginnings, even amidst the ache. Mittens, with her ancient eyes and quiet dignity, had taught her about resilience, about the profound courage in simply enduring, in finding warmth in a sunbeam, in accepting kindness, even when your heart feels shattered. She'd shown her that love, in its purest form, is often silent. A presence, a choice to stay, a paw resting gently on a knee in the gathering dusk. Sarah leaned forward, resting her forehead gently against Mittens' warm flank, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of her fur, sunshine and dust and something uniquely, essentially. Mittens. Tears pricked her eyes, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude for this small, fierce, magnificent creature who had walked into her hollow world and, without fanfare, begun to fill it. Fill it with quiet companionship, with unexpected courage, with a love that felt as deep and ancient as the roots of the old oak tree outside. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible, breathed into the soft fur. "Thank you for staying." Mittens' purr deepened, a soft thunder in the quiet room. Her paw flexed slightly on Sarah's knee. "I know." Sarah realized wasn't the enemy. It was the loom, weaving threads of loss and love, memory and presence, past and present, into the unique, irreplaceable tapestry of a life. Mittens was a golden thread in hers, a thread that had appeared when the fabric felt most threadbare, and strengthened it, warmed it, made it whole in a way she hadn't known was possible. Mittens lived through that spring, and into the lush green heart of summer. Her steps grew slower, her naps longer, deeper. She spent hours in her sunbeam, a small island of warmth and peace. Sarah cherished every moment, every slow blink, every rumbling purr. She knew the seasons were turning, the sunbeam wouldn't always hold the same warmth for her old friend. One warm August afternoon, the sunlight dappling the rug, the scent of cut grass drifting through the open windows, Mittens passed away. Not in distress, not in fear. She simply, in her sleep, in her favorite sunbeam, stopped breathing. Her body, finally, surrendered to the quiet weight of her many years. She looked peaceful, her face relaxed, the ancient watchfulness finally, completely, at rest. Sarah found her. The silence that followed wasn't the hollow silence of before. It was a different kind of quiet, vast, respectful, filled with the echo of a profound love. She knelt beside her friend, tears flowing freely, silently, her hand resting on the still warm fur. There was grief, sharp and deep, a physical tearing in her chest. But beneath it, woven through the pain, was gratitude. A deep, abiding peace. She had been there. She had witnessed. She had loved and been loved completely. She buried Mittens in the garden, beneath the old oak tree, where dappled sunlight would fall. Beside the small mound, she placed a smooth river stone. Not engraved, just a marker, a testament to presence. And she knew, in her bones, that the love, the lessons, the quiet courage Mittens embodied hadn't gone. It was in the walls of the house that had sheltered them both. It was in the warmth of the sunbeam on the rug. It was in Sarah's own heart, forever changed. A few days later, Sarah found herself driving, not aimlessly, but with purpose. The route was familiar now. Past the streets softening with late summer green, past the park where she'd walked her grief, towards the faded sign, Haven County Animal Shelter. She walked inside. The air hit her, the blend of antiseptic, kibble, hope, anxiety. The hum, the distant barks, the plaintive meows. Chloe was there, sorting donations. Her eyes widened slightly in recognition, then softened, seeing the quiet sorrow and the quiet strength in Sarah's face. Sarah, her knowing. How's Mittens? Sarah took a breath. The words came, simple too. She passed. Peacefully. She was amazing. Tears threatened again, but she smiled through them. She saved me, you know? Chloe's eyes glistened. She nodded, a lump in her throat. They do that. The quiet ones, the old souls, they sneak right in. They do, Sarah agreed, her voice thick. She looked around at the rows of cages, the hopeful eyes, the weary patience in the senior alcove. Her gaze settled on a cage in the corner, bottom row. Not empty. A large, gentle-looking tabby with cloudy eyes, his card reading estimated 12 years. Owner moved to nursing home. Love's quiet lapse. Sarah walked towards him, not with desperation this time, not fleeing a hollow silence. She walked with purpose, with an open heart, scarred but resilient, carrying the quiet warmth of a love that had changed everything. She crouched, just as she had months ago, her fingertips not quite touching the bars. "Hey there, handsome," she murmured, her voice warm, steady. "Just looking." The old tabby lifted his head, his cloudy eyes finding hers. He blinked. Slowly, deliberately. Sarah blinked back. This story, it's for anyone who's ever felt the weight of an empty room, who's ever looked into ancient eyes and seen a reflection of their own quiet ache. It's a reminder that sometimes rescue works both ways. That love arrives on silent paws, and healing comes in the softest purrs. That the oldest souls, the ones others overlook, often hold the deepest wisdom, the quietest courage, the power to mend a broken world, one sunbeam, one gentle blink, at a time. Hold space for the Mittens of the world. You never know whose hollow silence they might fill, including your own. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of a quiet companion who changed your world, please let us know. Share your own moments of unexpected love in the comments below. Like and share this story so its message of quiet hope can reach others walking their own path through grief. And subscribe, tap that bell, so you never miss these journeys into the profound, often wordless, connections that stitch our lives back together. Because stories like this Stories of resilience, of second chances found in the oldest shelter cages, of love whispered in purrs and felt in a paw resting gently on your knee. These are the stories that remind us we're not alone. They're the stories worth sharing, worth remembering, worth pressing better. So you can join us every day for the next tale that might just mend a little piece of your own heart. Until next time, hold your loved ones close, furry or otherwise, and cherish the quiet warmth.